Welcome to another episode of Unlocking California Politics. I'm Sanjay Wagle, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for the California Association of Realtors. Today, we have with us two of the most prominent political experts in California to discuss the March primary election and to look forward to the November election. I'm going to start by welcoming back Josh Walters, who has served in many different capacities in the state legislature for Democratic leadership and has been at the helm of many winning campaigns. Glad you could join us. Welcome back, Josh.
Thanks for having me, Sanjay.
And welcome back to Rob Stutzman, a seasoned strategist and political expert who served as Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger's Deputy Chief of Staff. And we're happy to have you here with us as well.
Thanks, Sanjay.
Okay, first, let's start with the recent primary election. Historically, the March primary is regarded as an election that does not have as high Democratic turnout as the November election. And so in California terms, and let me be very clear, in California terms, is a somewhat more conservative electorate. Can you explain or give me your thoughts, and I'll start with Josh, as to why that is? Why is the Democratic turnout tend to be a little lower in March?
Well, I think there's two questions. I think there's the primary election versus the general election, and this year we had it in March as opposed to June. So we typically see some fall off between June and November elections, but I think the March turnout's been somewhat abysmal. The short answer is I just think Republicans tend to be much better voters. They're more consistent and they show up. And then on the Democratic side, we tend to see these surges that go between the primary election and then the general election. And then certainly we saw it here where we had a primary in March where it was pretty dismal turnout on the Democratic side. I think there wasn't really anything at the top of the ticket that was likely exciting any voters from this side of the aisle. And at the same time, there's different factions of voters. And so it wasn't as though, you saw young Democratic voters had something to turn out. Generally, it was just kind of a ho-hum election, I think, from the Democratic side of things. And then you have an election in March in which, Californians still aren't really used to voting in March. So I think it raises the question of, Democrats' efforts to move elections to the March primary, if it really makes sense, if you're trying to drive voter turnout and greater participation, if that's a successful thing or not. I think the numbers show that it's likely not. It does produce a more conservative electorate, but certainly that wasn't Democrats' goal when they moved their primary to March too. So it's a little bit of a conundrum why they continue to pursue this strategy. For me, it means that I'm working over the Christmas holiday, trying to get it ready for elections. And so June makes a lot much more sense from a participation and then, a holiday with my family's approach. But it's interesting to see if this causes any changes amongst the Democratic leaders in the legislature.
Rob, what are your thoughts?
Well, so I agree with Josh on moving up the election to March from June. Turned out to be a poor gambit, really because there was no competitive presidential primaries. I'm sure when the election was set for March, there was thinking that Joe Biden might not be running again for re-election. We'd have a competitive Democratic primary and a certain governor or vice president, both from California, might be running and wanted that March date. It didn't turn out that way. Look, the other thing about it's just true in primaries in general is that younger voters typically don't vote as much. So when we talk about lower Democrat turnout, it's proportionally they underperform because just younger people typically don't vote in this election like they do in a general election. But who really underperforms are declined estates or independents. That's what we call them in this state, or actually no party preference. We name them everything but independents, it seems like. But they don't they don't really participate at all. They're about 23% of the electorate in terms of registered. I think the last number I saw was about 13% of the overall turnout were independents. So they just don't feel like there's as much for them in these partisan primaries because it's elections within the parties.
So the U.S. Senate race in this primary was interesting in that we had Democratic candidate Adam Schiff essentially trying to increase Republican turnout by elevating Republican candidate Steve Garvey. And those television ads ran on Fox News, among other places. I had friends who would talk to me, knowing I'm in the political arena, who would say, "Oh, did you see those Steve Garvey ads?" And I was like, "Those are not actually Steve Garvey ads. Those are Adam Schiff ads about Steve Garvey." And I don't think he actually. I could be mistaken, but I don't think he actually ran any ads, meaning Steve Garvey himself.
No.
So I don't think he had any money to run ads. So if we could talk about two things to start with. First, I think the reasons are obvious, but if you could elaborate on why would he do this, and have you seen other elections in California where this has happened, this type of strategy? And we'll start with Rob.
Well, sure. So in top two primaries, which we have in California, so the top two, no matter of party, regardless of party, go to the November election, and only those two. This has been a tactic that we've seen since this system's been put in place, where a Democrat frontrunner has the ability to elevate a Republican into second place over rival Democrats and ensure that there's a Democrat versus Republican runoff, which means Democrats going to win 99.9% of the time. Governor Gavin Newsom did the same thing in 2018 as he elevated Republican John Cox over former LA Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa. But it's also worth pointing out this happens even without the top two system. Gray Davis did it back in 2002, elevating Bill Simon in the Republican primary over LA Mayor Dick Reardon because Gray did not want to run against Dick Reardon. And it just happened in the Ohio Senate race last week in a primary there, where the National Democrats elevated, actually, ironically, the same candidate that Donald Trump was elevating, a guy named Bernie Moreno, who they think they have a better chance of beating with their incumbent Sherrod Brown in Ohio. So it's becoming almost a bit of an in fashion political tactic these days to mess around in the other party's primary.
Josh?
Well, it is an interesting tactic, and certainly we're seeing it on the legislative races as well, where Democrat leaders are trying to pick the Republican opponents for their candidates that get through. So it is interesting. I mean, the one thing it definitely requires is resources. So in most races, and a statewide candidate in California, you're trying as you might just to get enough money to put your message out there. So you usually don't even have enough money to attack your opponent.
Good
It's just
point.
all positive on yourself. And then to even have the resources then to go promote a whole other candidate, it's just, you really have to have a lot of firepower in the bank account to really even make this feasible. So it's not something that you really see, at a small local level or even at a highly contested, where a crowded primary field for a legislative race where you don't see the firepower of one candidate over the other. I mean, really, you got to have the finances to go up and put statewide ads across Fox News, and then still for Mr. Schiff to be pushing his own message to his own voters. So it's just one of the advantages that you have when you have a pretty big war chest when you go into these elections.
So increasing Republican turnout could also, though, have some potential downside effects for other Democrats. Do you think it seemed like there were some races where Republicans outperformed. Do you think Schiff's strategy ultimately did increase Republican turnout, and did it have an effect in any of the races? And I'll start with Josh.
It'll be interesting to hear Rob's opinion on this. I mean, just from the way I usually look at these things, it's, we just kind of think the Republican turnout's likely going to be pretty close to what it's going to be. And so it's not whether or not somebody drove additional, Republicans to vote or not, where it's really on the Democratic side of things of, where we see the shift of participation and can you motivate a block of voters really to show up or to do that. So it's not clear to me that Schiff's tactic really got more Republicans out to vote. It's just that the Republicans that did vote, that's who that they ended up voting for was Mr. Garvey, and then putting him into that position. So, so that's kind of how I look at that. I don't think, but anyway, I'll just kick it over to Rob now to see kind of his perspective on that.
Rob?
Well, I agree with Josh. I don't think Schiff was trying to increase Republican turnout. What he was trying to do was indicate to Republican primary voters who were going to vote that, hey, he's your guy. So he was consolidating Republicans into Schiff. I'm sorry, into Garvey. There were several other Republicans on the ballot, but they're no-name candidates. They didn't have resources. Garvey had an element of nominal fame, or maybe a little more nominal, depending how old you are. I can remember him playing, but you got to be about my age. So I don't think it was a turnout gambit as much as it was just making sure that Republicans that were voting were really driven into Garvey's arms.
Right, and I guess I didn't mean as a turnout gambit, but there's a risk that it would have resulted in higher turnout. So you think it just more helped tilt the existing Republican voters to Garvey rather than increasing the turn. It didn't have that effect.
Yeah, I do. Look, I I mean, the Republican turnout. You remember? I mean, the ballots were distributed the first week of February. Nikki Haley was still running. You
Right.
still had a little bit of a somewhat competitive Republican primary going on, and we saw an earlier proportion of Republican ballots returned early in the month than you typically do. So I mean, there are already other factors going on that were really driving quote unquote Republican turnout. Now the irony is if the governor had lost Prop One, which I'm sure we'll get to, yes,
Mhm.
I'm sure there'd be some analysis of what role did Schiff's campaign play, in turning out a few thousand too many Republicans.
That's true. That was tight. Yeah, and we will get to that. So now let's talk about the state races for Assembly and Senate. Were there any races which surprised you or you think maybe have some meaning for us beyond the two candidates? So surprises or races that might give us some clues about California politics. And I'll start with Rob.
I don't think anything that really surprised me. There were, in some state Senate races, Chris Cabaldon ran, I thought, stronger than probably most people thought to replace Senator Bill Dodd in a Napa Solano seat. I thought Tim Grayson ran very strong, sitting assemblyman
Hmm.
running against. It'll be a rematch in the fall because it's just a progressive Democrat, but he won almost 2-1, which
Yeah.
somewhat portends of how that will probably go in the fall. But the other thing that really I thought was caught my eye was how many state legislators who were moving on, particularly in LA, where we had three legislators run for LA City Council, and
Hmm.
none of them made runoffs down there. And then on Congress, we saw quite a few legislators lose. Saw a couple advance to runoffs in congressional races. Still waiting as we're recording this to see if Assemblyman Lowe is going to advance to a congressional runoff in the South Bay area. But it's pretty clear just because you're a state legislator doesn't mean you have a ticket to your next office.
Josh?
Well, one of the things that I thought was interesting was the primary was a difficult election for two particular candidates from the Democratic establishment. So we saw Rusty Hicks, the former chair of the California Democratic Party, run for state assembly in the North Coast seat, and he was not successful in his bid to do so, despite having an inordinate amount of support from organized labor in that effort. And then again, Catherine Lieberger, who's the current president of the
Right.
California Labor Federation, ran for a Senate seat in the Berkeley area and the East Bay there. And again, an incredible amount of spending there, and they were not able to get the current president of the Labor Fed elected, to the state senate. So both of those candidates are not advancing, and they were highly contested. There's a lot of spending, so I think that's just kind of interesting to me too. So to Rob's point is just because you're a member of the legislature doesn't mean you can get to other elected office. But here, just having traditional leadership roles in the Democratic Party doesn't necessarily mean that the voters want you to represent them in the state legislature as well. So that was pretty interesting to me. Also, it was just there were a lot of really competitive primaries. So this was a year in which a lot of the races were just settled in March for the year, and so that pushed a lot of the spending forward. And most of these were Democrat on Democrat races, where you would see certain coalitions would go in. Obviously, like pro labor organizations would support a labor candidate, and the business side of things would support business candidates. And I think business had a pretty good. We had a pretty good year overall. Looking at the races that I know the realtors got involved with, and some of the organizations I do as well. So it was a pretty good year. And then then we move on to November, where it's more a Democrat versus Republican lineup, or kind of traditionally how we think about things.
So you mentioned two candidates backed by labor, which were not successful. Portantino in the Los Angeles area on a congressional race is probably another example of that, who had heavy labor backing and was not successful. Do you think that is just a matter of the specific candidate versus any other factors that might be at play? And I'll start with Rob.
Yeah, look, I can't the field geography. I mean, Rusty Hicks, who Josh mentioned, who was the CDP chair, he was running for a North Coast seat. He's from Los Angeles. Uh, that's a seat where carpetbagging mattered, and they pounded him on that.
Yeah.
Portantino lost, but he lost to another state legislator, and Laura
Right.
Friedman in the Schiff seat. And I always thought DePortantino was going to struggle in that seat because his base, where he's been elected, was just a smaller part of that seat than the West LA San Fernando part of the seat that Freeman represented. So there's always these other elements. I think the takeaway is just having institutional support or being of the institution of the legislature doesn't guarantee you much, is all.
Josh?
Yeah, I mean, I think our voters in California are fairly sophisticated. So, they care about what their region cares about, and all politics is local. So, on the North Coast, they're not going to be, they don't care that you were the head of the Democratic Party. Do you care about the North Coast? And that's what we need. So, I mean, and certainly it wasn't, labor unions continue to be popular in the state. So it wasn't that, people were supported by labor. So, that was a bad thing. It was just that they just had the wrong candidates in these instances, and they just weren't a good fit for the district. So ultimately, I think that's what happened. So
Right, and in many of those where labor backed them, like Portland, and again in the congressional race, it wasn't like Laura Friedman isn't pro labor,
Right.
so it's not
yeah.
like there was somehow an anti-labor candidate won. Are there any races that you are going to be watching in particular in November as a result of what happened in March? And I'll start with you, Josh.
Yeah, I mean, in the Senate, there's a really important race in the high desert where former Republican leader Mr. Wilk is termed out, and so former Assembly Member Suzette Valladares will be running on the Republican
Hmm.
side, and it'll be a redo against a gentleman, who ran on the Democrat side before. And so that's going to be a very competitive race. And it's going to be one where you're going to see spending on both sides. And certainly the business organization is going to come in and try and hold that. I mean, I don't think we're in a position where we're really looking at a bunch of pickup seats on the Republican side of things. It's more, can we hold the line and keep the current, folks that we do have? And that's essentially the task that we're going to have there. So that's probably one of the top priorities for me. And we don't really have that many Republicans left in the Senate, so keeping those that we have is going to be critical.
Rob?
Well, yeah, I was going to identify the same race, but in the same vein, I'd also point out Senator Rosa Lisi Bogue will have a
Hmm.
competitive reelection. I think she's favored there, but it'd be something that business in particular would need to be mindful of and make sure that they're spending adequately to support her. I do think there's some interesting places that could get competitive, especially if Democrat turnout is looks like it may suffer in the fall. Sabrina Cervantes moving on to a Senate seat that might get somewhat competitive, and her sister is running behind her for an assembly seat.
Hmm.
And again, one of these at press time calls, she's about 200 votes ahead of another Democrat to make the runoff. She probably is going to make it. We haven't seen family members do well together on the ballot at the same time. We just had the Villapoudois go down to
Hmm.
defeat in San Joaquin County. And of course, we are mindful of what happened to the Hertzbergs 2 years ago. And I just think that'll be an interesting dynamic. Seats that lean Democrat, but could be competitive with good Republican candidates. And if you get this odd dynamic going, what exactly, again, voters are smart, they start to sort these things out. And we'll see how it goes for the Cervantes sisters.
Well, Rob, you touched on the issue of turnout in the November election. So let's go there now. I think in the past, people would have thought, oh, a Biden-Trump rematch in California would probably help drive Democratic turnout once again, just like it did 4 years ago. I think a lot of people are less certain of that, given the New York Times keeps calling this the election that nobody wants. How do you think turnout might look compared to the last election? Given the presidential dynamics, and I'll start with Josh.
Well, I mean, I think you're right. I think it's not a very exciting election for a lot of folks. And then, you have these coalitions on the Democrat side where people are saying this is existential. You have to go out and vote because if this happens, it's going to be the end of the world. But I think it's pretty clear that, we've been through one Trump presidency and, it wasn't the end of the world. And now we've been through a Biden presidency and you can argue it's also not going to be the end of the world. And so it's just, people are just, I think, just they're just not excited about it and they just kind of don't believe the rhetoric. So I think that traditional thing of, using that to incite voters to go out is going to be challenging. And then at the top of the ticket, I don't see a bunch of ballot measures that are likely going to be exciting for these coalition of folks. So I think it really could suffer. I think Democrat turnout could be a pretty low year, which could impact some of these competitive seats. I think it'll certainly help the Republicans that are trying to hold the current seats that they have in those competitive seats. And to Rob's point, maybe we see some interesting twists in the Inland Empire, with the Cervantes district. So I think it creates some opportunity. And the key is just to be ready for it. So you just never really know with the atmospherics what's going to happen, but you have to be ready to go out and play and put resources into the game to create opportunities there. So that's going to be the important part, is to be well positioned.
Rob?
I mean, I agree again with I think Josh's analysis. It is we're in a I think we're in a political realignment. So a lot of what consultants do is rely on history to help guide them to what's their tactics should be in a current election cycle. But 4 years ago, what has always been tried and true in presidential years in California, which is where Republicans would lose down
Hmm.
ballot, wasn't true. Even though Biden obviously won the state, won the presidency. So I think we're into some new paradigms, and voters are realigning and trying to figure out exactly how they want to behave. I think we can count on, though, the top of the ticket for both parties being incredibly unpopular. I don't think that's going to change. Joe Biden's not going to get any younger. Donald Trump's not going to all of a sudden be sane. And they're unpopular with substantial swaths of their own party. And I think it's really hard to know. Then are those people that just don't vote, or are there going to be third party candidates that do draw them out, or does
Hmm.
something else draw them to the polls? It's kind of a fool's errand, to try to estimate that too much at this point, because really we have an unprecedented election coming up.
The slim passage of Proposition 1 was a surprise to many. What do you think happened, Josh?
Um, well, I mean, obviously, I think the electorate, right, and the low Democratic turnout was a challenge for Prop One. And then I think, to be honest, I think there was some confusion potentially among voters where you saw an entire ad campaign focused on veterans and veterans issues, and then when you went and looked at Prop One, it didn't really present that
Hmm.
as being the face of that. So I think there could have been a little disconnect there that could have caused some issues. So.
Rob?
Well, I think largely it was the makeup of the electorate. I mean, we probably have more than twice as many people vote in the fall. But the governor's team made a decision to go with the early ballot, knowing this could be a challenge to them. You also have a lot of talk about budget deficits, and then here comes a bond. The governor was making this a signature ask of him,
Mhm.
and whereas sure he'd get elected 2-1 against Larry Elder again tomorrow, he also now has consistently been underwater on approval ratings to disapproval ratings. So it's not like he's got a lot of muscle with the voters at the moment. And it
Hmm.
just it all adds up to this real nail biter that we had. Uh, it's worth remembering that there was a primary ballot bond that the governor's team ran 4 years ago on the primary ballot education bond, and that lost. So it's
Right.
just, I think we've already discussed it's the primary ballot is a very dangerous place for bond measures to go on to. And I think they're fortunate that they got it through.
Okay, before we keep moving on to other topics, and this kind of goes back a little to how state legislators performed in local races, just going to go to Los Angeles a little because it's kind of where I'm my California roots are, anyways. And so, two things. One, what do you think about the city council race where Kevin De Leon now gets to be the moderate in an electoral race? And I also just found it was interesting in Los Angeles in general, despite the backlash, I guess you could say, against ULA to some extent, we still seem to be seeing the very left side of the electorate doing very well in the Los Angeles area. And any thoughts about that? And I'll start with Rob.
Yeah, and look, there's no question that Los Angeles city politics are trending towards, I mean, what I would say is a bit more radical, liberal. This has been going on for the last couple cycles, at least. That trend at least continued, I think, continued to manifest itself in the primaries. The De Leon, if De Leon survives and gets reelected, that'll be the new master class on how to relentlessly avoid scandal and not give in to your foes. And I would think he has a real chance of pulling it off.
Yeah.
I'll
Josh?
point out what
Oh,
point out real I'm sorry, real
sure.
quick is that the county though, that's the city. The county continues, I think, to kind of behave as it always have.
Right.
You know, Supervisor Barger won over 50%, no runoff. She's reelected, the only Republican there, and it's clear that the DA is going to face a very tough challenge in getting reelected countywide in November.
Josh?
Well, I mean, I think what this shows is just really the challenge that we have of getting reasonable people elected to our state legislature as well. So when you have our urban core, where the bulk of population is in California, thus the bulk of the state assembly and senate races
Mhm.
are this progressive. Where we see it even at the local level, it proves as to how hard it is really for us to go out and find pro business folks that are willing to come and put their name on the ballot and run. And for organizations such as the ones we work with to try and get them elected. I mean, it's the urban cores are very, very progressive. So we have to continue to try and find good folks that can appeal to them, and still have a sense of reasonableness when it comes to business as well. So that's really the challenge we have. So.
Do you think some of that success is just due to, frankly, better grassroots organizing, or what do you think? I mean, some of it might just be the inclination of the voting pool, but when you sometimes look at actual surveys of these areas in terms of what people believe, they're not necessarily as left as the people who represent them. So, is it a matter of organization? What do you think is going on? And I'll start with you, Josh.
Well, I mean, I got, you say, well, you do a survey and they're not as progressive as that, but then you see these election results
Hmm.
and, the people that are showing up are pushing them forward. So, I mean, again, not everybody participates in the primary election. So you get a snapshot of those that do participate. But I mean, those communities are very progressive.
Okay.
And I mean, I think, but I also think that as business folks, we're getting better at finding good candidates that can come in and be part of the community and share, some of the core social values and still have a more business acumen and a different approach in that perspective. So I think overall we're just getting, you can't trick the voters. Like you're just not going to be
Right.
able to. I mean, you can try, but so it really comes down to candidate recruitment, finding the right people, and then having those people feel like there's going to be the support, from the organization, such as the realtors and others, for that to be there for them, that they can put their name forward. So I think we're getting better and better at this, and it's just going to continue over time. Just because as California continues to be a clearly blue state, how do we continue to become, more business friendly in the legislature and get those folks elected? So I think we're getting better at it, and we're building better relationships with candidates, and that's how that's going to go forward.
Rob?
Well, I think look, they are organized on the left, particularly the flex that DSA, Democratic Socialists of America,
Right.
have been imposing on in urban areas. So, but you're still talking about low turnout elections. The urban turnouts were is worse below the statewide turnout. It's lower registration in these districts, and when you have low turnout, it optimizes the effectiveness of your organization. So I think you have a bit of a confluence of low turnout circumstance, and then sure, those that are organized are going to overperform, over-index, if you will, against maybe what the true deep belief of some of those communities might be. But they got to get out and vote, unless they're going to be represented by people that probably don't really align with them.
So there have been a number of issues recently which have been emerging, and I think we're seeing political responses to them, such as crime and with Proposition One, homelessness. What are going to be, you think, the top issues on the minds of voters that politicians are going to need to respond to in the fall election in November? And I'll start with you, Rob. What's top
I
of
think it's
mind?
yeah. Homelessness is top of mind, but I don't see much evidence that voters think the politicians can fix it or know what to do. I think it's one of the reasons Prop One struggled is they don't think this is a problem of money being spent. So it's going to be on their top of mind, but I don't know they're going to believe any politician that says they can fix it. I continue to think this is a cost of living election. I think that translates into energy prices, particularly in California. And you see, I think, a lot of panic beginning to set in with the legislature as they see electricity prices skyrocket and a bunch of increases in regulatory programs that will affect gasoline that's on tap and about ready to take place over the
Hmm.
next 12 to 18 months. So I think that's something they're really going to be trying to address. If you think about congressional races in this state, there's two of them that Republicans won 2 years ago because the Democratic candidates had supported increases in gas tax or programs that
Right.
increase the price of gas. I think you're going to see a lot of that litigated again in these types of close races.
Josh?
I completely agree about cost of living. I mean, homelessness and crime are big concerns, but at the end of the day, people are just struggling to get by, and so that's how they're going to be making a lot of their decisions, I think. And so, if you're somebody, and then you have an environment also where the budgets, we have our budget challenges in California and our booms and busts, and certainly the administration and the legislature is projecting that it's not the great budget times that it was a few years ago, and
Right.
so you have a situation where you have a legislature that's never really made cuts or hasn't made cuts, the current crop of folks, and so they're looking at how do we trim down and live within our means, and then there's going to be pressure from outside groups to potentially find other revenues, and I just think that's going to be a really really hard sell going forward. So I really feel that there's no appetite for additional revenue. And then, but to loop back on Rob's point about energy, I mean, not only have we seen electricity prices increase, but I mean, there's some regulatory actions on the horizon that could see them increase even
Right.
more in the next couple of months. And so, it's kind of like the electricity prices are just getting started. And so, as people start to feel that, you can imagine a hot summer and really high electricity bills. Going into the fall, people are going to be pretty upset, right? So instead of going on family vacation, you're paying your energy bill, and that's going to be frustrating for folks.
So, Josh, when you said people seem to be would likely not be too responsive to new attempts to raise revenue, basically taxes, you think sort of a bipartisan among the voters, uh, reluctance on the tax issue?
Yeah, I think there's absolutely no appetite for that at all. So
Rob,
Well, I
on
agree. I think that,
taxes?
yeah, I agree. The governor, I think, has been pretty firm on that. There was, I don't know, about 6 weeks ago or so, the speaker maybe, kept the door open. He's got to keep people in his caucus happy. And the governor quickly shut that down. I don't think there'll be any discussion of taxes this year. Now, if we're in this circumstance again next year, we'll see, but not this year in the election year.
So the next thing there are gonna be I'm not even sure at last count. There's gonna be a lot of initiatives on the November ballot. Are there any that you're in particular watching or think, will be close or that are especially important, politically? And I'll start with you, Rob.
Yes, I think the effort led by the District Attorneys Association to qualify a retail theft measure, which also will address some fentanyl statutes. I think they're likely to make the ballot. They're still gathering signatures. I think
Mhm.
that'll get a lot of attention and will be a welcome welcome addition to the ballot for a lot of Californians that want to vote on this issue. I think that'd be something to keep an eye on. I think you'll see a lot of Democrats in more moderate districts probably come on board with that. That's the one I'd be keep a big eye on.
Josh?
I think the one on the other side that has the potential to maybe do a little bit of voter turnout would be the rent control measure. So you see traditionally younger folks have strong interest in voting and supporting rent control. So that could be a Democratic turnout effort where you could see people try and put some money into that effort to really fuel that and get some people out to the polls in areas where it would make a difference. So that's one I'll be looking at as well.
Thanks, Josh. So, from the congressional perspective, the Democrats are very much trying to win back the House in the coming election. Are there any California races which you think could actually help tip that balance? Where, for example, certain Republican races which have been sort of flipping back and forth might go back to the D column. And I'll start with you, Rob.
Oh yeah, look, whoever's going to have the majority in Congress, that road goes through New York and California. It's really about the seats in those two states where Republicans outperformed the rest of the country 2 years ago. So there's a couple races in the Valley. There's three in Orange and Color, L.A., and then you've got the Katie Porter seat on the Democrat side, which of course is now an open seat. State Senator Dave Min will be running against Scott Baugh, the Republican. I think that's a real toss up. So that could be one the Republicans could actually pick up. But California will feel like, if you live in Southern California or the Central Valley, it's going to feel like ground zero on the House of Representatives.
Josh?
Oh yeah, we're just going to be pummeling the Central Valley folks, right? Well, the Central Valley is great because it's a really tight media market, and it's just mail there is really affordable. So you're going to really see budgets. Those poor voters there are really going to feel it all the way through. So it'll be interesting to see. Certainly, Mr. Former Assembly Member Adam Gray is going to be trying to take that seat from John Duarte. So that'll be very hard fought. And then of course David Valadao always seems to get through down there in the southern part of the valley as well. So it's going to be fun to watch.
All right. Now, looking ahead to 2026, Governor Newsom is terming out, and I know it's early days, but how do you see that race playing out at this early stage? How do you think it might start to move? And are there any Republicans running yet? So I'll start with you, Rob. Any viable
Well,
Republicans?
yeah, I'm not aware of any viable Republicans at the moment, although it is early.
Mm-hmm.
Look, I mean,
Early days.
it's a cattle call of Democrat constitutional officers, former
Mm-hmm.
constitutional officer, uh, termed out former Senate Pro Tem Tony Atkins. It's the Lieutenant Governor Kunalakis, AG Bonta, uh, former state controller, Tony Thurman is superintendent of public instruction. I think the next thing to develop over the next over 12 months will be who doesn't run out of this large
Okay.
group. So there'll be this primary before the primary of who can get endorsements, secure money, or paths to money, and I think we'll see the field winnow. I also think these are all candidates with virtually single digit name ID statewide. It leaves a huge vacuum for someone to come in and disrupt that can either self finance or may have some name ID, some pre awareness. So it'll be interesting to watch. This isn't a field that's going to scare other people away from taking a look at it.
Hmm. Josh?
To me, one of the most interesting things is whether current AG Bonta runs or not, because if he does decide to run, I mean, that opens up that seat. And I think that the attorney general's race in California, just given what's happening around homelessness and crime and retail theft, I think that could be a really interesting bellwether battle to see happen there. So I'm very interested to see how that shakes out as well. So I mean, again, Mr. Bonta hasn't officially said that he's definitely running yet as of today. But I think everybody seems to think that that's the likely result. So yeah, so the AG's race is kind of what I'm really excited about. So I think that's gonna be the fun one.
Yeah, that's true. That would be an interesting. Okay. Um, so based on what you've seen in this past primary election, as well as what you're anticipating for November, in terms of the makeup of the California legislature, any big changes in terms of maybe its direction, its orientation from where it is now? And I'll start with Josh.
Well, I mean, I unfortunately for those on the Republican side of things, I don't think we can expect to be any big shift back in that direction. So, I mean, really, it's just managing and holding the seats that we currently have on that side of the aisle, and then going on to the other side is, can we figure out how to get more business friendly Democrats? So I think, again, I said we're getting better at finding business friendly Democrats and getting them elected. I think that's a skill set that we're working to perfect. But overall, the legislature, I think it's going to be more of the same. And then, it's just different groups. We're just trying to figure out how do we go in and build relationships with these new folks. And we don't, they tell us how they're going to be, but you don't really know how somebody's going to be until there's
Right.
a bill in front of them that's on your issue and they go up or down, right? And you've spent a lot of time educating them, and then you really know. So I think, my current thought is we're kind of going to be status quo. But I think the good news is we're continuing to learn how to navigate in this environment. We're getting better at it. And so I think that's what I'm most excited about.
Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Josh. Status quo in terms of the D versus R numbers; those there aren't that many competitive seats. So nothing's much going to change there. The interesting thing is there's going to be a lot of new members. Like 30, 37, 38 new members in
Right.
all likelihood. It comes on the heels of around 40 new members in the past cycle. So, the cycle right behind us and the cycle that we're in the middle of, it's going to be the members that largely run the place for the next decade. And qualitatively, does some of that change? I don't think we know until they get up here and start doing some work, as Josh was saying, until until they cast a vote. But it could be a year or two from now. We're reflecting back, and we feel like it's different than the legislature
Right.
that we had just a couple years ago.
So, in conclusion, for our members, many who are listening to this, what's the best thing they can do in terms of obviously vote? But what are the kind of things they can do to help affect the elections, the electoral process, to elect candidates who represent their interests? And just a quick reminder, we are a bipartisan organization who support candidates of all stripes who support our interests. And so, what kinds of things should our members be doing to get involved? A real focus we've been trying to talk to them about is the importance of starting early, getting involved locally as well. But I'll start with you, Josh.
Well, first of all, just being active and engaged is the number one thing. And your members are very good at going out and doing the hard work and getting involved. And frankly, I mean, your members are very good at marketing it, right? So the thing is they can go in and find a candidate that's really good on the issues, and they know how to tell their friends and their community members and everybody out there about that. And just as much as word of mouth is important in their reputations in their business, it's important in politics too. So when they speak for a candidate, into their social groups, I think that's really helpful and it means a lot. So, and unfortunately, most realtors have pretty big social networks as well, just because that's the nature of their business. So I think they're uniquely positioned to really help people on the grassroots level and just continue to harness those networks, and please do that work.
All right, great. Thanks, Josh. Rob?
I obviously agree with all that. Make sure you're supporting the pack. But that local involvement is critical. And I would say work on your peers. My guess is if you're a realtor right now listening to this, you have 5 or 6 colleagues you can think of that probably aren't as committed to the politics of the side of the business and are not listening to
Hmm.
this podcast. And so, encourage those that you work with to become even more involved themselves. They do have the benefit, if you're a realtor, of being a member of one of the most powerful, strongest private business trade organizations in the state.
Right.
And I'm not being paid to say that, as you all know. The realtors are very, very impactful, and so lean into that and build that strong muscle even stronger.
All right. Thank you very much, Josh and Rob. And I look forward, hopefully, to seeing you in late November as we try to parse through the November results in light of what we've said today. And should be a very interesting election coming up. And thank you once again.
Oh, thanks for having us. All right.
Thank you.
Disclaimer. The purpose of this podcast, brought to you by the California Association of Realtors, C.A.R., is to provide general and educational information and opinions from a wide range of perspectives regarding politics, voting, elections, legislative issues, and more. The opinions, beliefs, and views expressed by guests or participants of this podcast are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions, beliefs, or views of C.A.R., its affiliates, their respective directors, officers, or employees. Reference to any individual or entity does not constitute an endorsement, recommendation, or any other position or opinion regarding that entity or individual by C.A.R. This podcast does not constitute professional advice or services of any kind. This podcast is available for private, non-commercial use only. You may not edit, modify, or redistribute this podcast.